further ado, I will give the word to you, Gerard.
Thank you so much, Niels. That's just lovely. And it's great to be back. I haven't yet made it to this wonderful room, I see, in Aarhus, although I've had invitations. So I hope that comes into the future. And it's a pleasure to join you all in the network. It's fantastic. And I just wanted particularly to say thank you to Jane Winters for the invitation as well. So I might just, maybe I'll just share screen in the Zoom tradition. Okay, so people see that okay? So thanks again, Niels, and you've got a interesting and 3 days ahead of you, no doubt. So what I wanted to talk about is this sort of work that Niels has already kindly set up on Asian internet histories and also mobile media histories, and to maybe offer some reflections on the transnational web heritage. I feel that you will know a hell of a lot more about web heritages than I will. So I hope this is useful for you. And as Niels mentioned, so, you know, Niels has sort of done the explanation in some ways, but I've been really fascinated by internet histories for quite a while, really since the sort of early 2000s, when I was just newly appointed to a country university in Australia and was working in some ways actually on futures of technologies, and was getting massively bored of the kind of ways in which that was framed, and so started to work on internet histories. And I was in a region called the Byron Bay region, which is where people have been harbouring, or film stars have been staying in a pandemic in Australia. But it was one of the places where the internet was invented in different parts of the world. So that gave rise to this book, Virtual Nation, the Internet in Australia, that Niels kindly mentioned. And so I've just been really fascinated since that time. I was going to write a cultural history of the internet in Australia, which that never happened. One of the great unfinished projects that we all have. Maybe you don't, but I have. But instead, I sort of segued across to working on mobile phones and mobile phone culture. So I've got one book, the cover of which I actually really like, which is, it's hard to get good covers in the academic trade these days, the Cell Phone Culture book, which is the first book I did on mobile media. And then the most recent one, which are part of the ideas of sort of eddying around in my head, approaching, your meeting today, is a book on apps, which has just come out, which I've just found a super interesting topic, and a very pandemic kind of topic, that apps have just been sheeted home to us in all sorts of ways that people are thinking about locative technology perhaps never dared to dream. So, I mean, to start with, I was just reflecting and trying to kind of catch up with much of the work that you have variously and collectively been doing, and just sort of thinking a little bit about, in say the field of internet histories and historical study of digital cultures, what's been achieved, and it seems to be quite a bit. And that there's been a lot of work, obviously, that's gone into the work that you're particularly engaged in the next 3 days, the infrastructures, the collections, repositories, and the tools to rebirth, I think the phrase of Niels from a paper, digital information and media, especially via web archives. So I think there's been a real sense in which capabilities have been, seriously built for the study of internet and digital cultures. And one of the things about the field is this, emergence in recent years, engagement in recent years with the emergence of digital humanities. And also, I suppose, what was called 20 years ago, e-research infrastructures, which has its own life and was very STEM-based, right? Very science, technology, engineering, health, medical sciences based. And I think digital humanities has woven itself in around that in some really interesting kind of ways. So I think there's been this sense of, trying to systematically theorize and develop a field. But there are, a hell of a lot of challenges, are there not? And so just reading and reflecting on this, I was reading Valerie and Jane's lovely piece on the values of web archives in the past web. Part of it they're talking about, this, as in this quote, towards multi-stakeholder and multi-scale engagement. Talking about the ways in which web archives are part of a complex and evolving ecosystem of different sorts. It requires increased access, but also transparency, accountability, reproducibility, sustainability, and perhaps importantly, legibility of what they call these complex knowledge infrastructures and born digital heritage. And another really useful piece in the password, the final piece with Julian Masson and co-authors. And he was obviously a kind of pioneer in the web archiving area. And I suppose capturing this sense in fairly clear language about, the public sphere and the various public interests, right? And this, one of the key motivations is in this quote here, that web archivists ought to be aware of the ethical duty to archive public content. And then I suppose this kind of injunction and imperative, which mostly seems to fail in the possibility and delivery that web users should be able to archive and access relevant content published on social media platforms, something we all would like to do and many people have tried. And say institutions in charge of web preservation should talk to the platform owners to make it easier for everyone to acquire and preserve online public information. Makes it sound like it could be done by having a chat to the digital platform operators. But it's a complex and important thing. And I suppose on that digital platforms, I was just, really struck me. I've been teaching a course this semester on global media policy, of which the overarching case across the semester is digital platforms. So in our colleague from Internet Histories editorial collective, Anat Ben David, has got this great piece on counter-archiving Facebook. And when she really just makes the point that after datification, this access to information really depends on the platform's benevolence. And she suggests, following, I think the work of various people, particularly Nick Coldry and others, the power of colonial archives' ability to keep citizens away from information until its contents become the realm of the depoliticised past, a pessimistic vision. So I wanted to just give a bit, paint some of that, that scene, some of the elements of the sort of, this kind of conjuncture, I suppose, and then move into reflecting on global internet histories. And again, I'm indebted to Niels for setting this up to say that a little while ago, 4 years ago, we published this book, Global Internet Histories, which was a wonderful thing to be able to do with people from a whole range of different perspectives and places, writing and theorising internet histories. And in that, one of the things we were struck by, and it's captured in this quote, is the idea that the internet should be understood in relation to different cultures of use, which are very much influenced by language, culture, geographical location. And I suppose part of our idea was that, once you assemble or some of or much of a detailed, variegated picture of the internet, it really then become possible to achieve a deeper appreciation of the internet's global or international character. Now, 4 or 5 years on, what's been the progress on this? Where do we think this is, and where do I think it is? I mean, I think significant achievements. Lucky to be able to publish some of these and consider them and muse upon them in the Internet Histories journals. There's a lot of work which is really pleasing across a whole bunch of other general journals in media, society, culture, and technology too. And that there's this kind of resurgence and picking up of interest, broader interest in histories across the field of media and communications, which I'm probably most centrally in. And just this week, there was a launch of a new open access History of Media Studies journal, which was a very exciting thing to see from Dave Park and Jeff Pooley and another colleague in the US. But clearly a lot lies ahead. And, particularly, I suppose, in terms of the global internet histories, it's pretty uneven for all sorts of reasons. like much of history, perhaps, unwritten, unformulated, or written and thought about, but not recognised by, a whole bunch of other people, that the work is actually going underway. So there's the lack of the histories, but there's the infrastructures, the web archives, and the efforts of the collections and collecting institutions, typically operating under, not sufficient funding or funding a bit, in jeopardy, with the tool, trying to get the tools and resources to develop capabilities and the researcher and archivist expertise. And I think also there's the slow process in translating in sort of multiple senses of bringing to bear work on internet histories across and among a wide range of culture and languages. And Kevin Driscoll and Camille Pollock-Berg have talked about the internet's essential plurality, and I think much of that is enmeshed in this kind of process. And the stakes are kind of pretty high, I think, and increasingly being recognised as such. And I was actually in this new journal, History of Media Studies, engaging in a heroic bit of procrastination in face of everything else I should have been doing at the end of the semester. I had a bit of a read of different pieces, and one of them I really liked was Wendy Wellham's work, which took me back to a 2014 paper, and talking about this longer disciplinary history outside the West, which has not only produced empirical knowledge, but it's actively challenged Western epistemologies. And then this more recent piece talking about the constitutive nature of race, responding to the recent movements around decolonising, the sort of resurgence of this effort, recognising how histories of slavery and colonialism make possible particular media institutions and technologies. Sitting in Singapore, we're very kind of conscious of this, as Singapore being a crossroads for centuries of different empires, different languages, of different kind of movements of people. Not much movement recently. Been stuck on an island that's about 30 miles across for 18 or so months, like other people during the pandemic. But I think here in Singapore, you see things like the telegraph when it came through in the 19th century. In part en route to other places like Australia, and you can see how those histories of colonialism are wound through the histories of technology. So, having sketched a little bit about global internet histories, and I think some of the great raft of unfinished business in that, but the teeming ideas that are starting to come through, and I think there's just incredibly exciting work. And also incredibly exciting conceptualization and theorization from some of those specificities of history and archives that people are bringing to bear now. So I wanted to particularly then talk about Asian internet histories and some of the potential it has for provincializing some of the general histories. And yeah, on the back of this Asian internet double special issue, which is about most of it's already out, published online, and I think the issues get formally published in a week or so. So there's a pretty simple kind of, or deceptively simple warrant for thinking about Asia. I mean, I'm placed here in various ways. In the school at Nanyang Technological University, which I sit, the Week in We School, 20, 30 years ago was one of the kind of major centres in actually trying to conceptualize Asian communications and trying to get it out of a sort of subsidiary minority status to thinking about it as a fully blown area, but also the sense in which there are clearly philosophies, histories of communication, of technology, and so on, that come from thinking around Asian communication. That's kind of now in some ways accepted, but the region itself increasingly is at the forefront of digital technology and cultural developments. More than half of global internet users, for instance, many of them mobile users. And so in our introduction, we're supposed putting the proposition that the contemporary and future landscapes of Asian internet and the centrality to global internet, underscore the importance of this research on Asian internet histories and imaginaries, and research that's very much kind of emergent. There's some really interesting kind of efforts in Asian internet histories that probably deserve to be better known. I mean, this is one by some internet pioneers, by Killam Chong, South Korean internet pioneer, who in the special issue is a great interview that Camille Pollock-Berg has done with him, talking about the various aspects of his role in shaping the internet. But he's done this really impressive history project. He's now gone into the 5th decade that's been published as well. And I've just got a screenshot of it up here and the overheads, which I can pass on, clickable as well. And then I wanted to just, shout out to the Web Archive in Singapore and its collection of websites. Some of them are very consistent with the official government representations here in Singapore, and one on the pandemic also. And my interest was struck actually because in another part of the research I do, I've had a long-standing interest in disability and digital technology, inclusive design, human rights and disability. And I've done quite a bit of work, written various papers since 2000 actually, since the Sydney Olympics and Paralympics, about Paralympics and media representation. We're just, with some Singapore and Australian researchers, we're writing a comparative piece about the Paralympics that have just passed. So I was intrigued that this is one of the featured things in the Web Archive in Singapore, because I know that more generally, as a transnational effort, this kind of transnational sport has been something that scholars have studied across disciplines, and particularly has been a focus and a kind of a thing for web archiving as well. Now, just I'm sure I'll just reveal my sort of boundless ignorance here in just musing out aloud about the International Internet Preservation Consortium. I remember giving a talk when they were in Canberra at the National Library for Australia quite some time ago, and just intrigued to see, wondering how many of the partners are in different Asian locations, diverse as that is. East Asia heavily represented, Japan, Singapore and Southeast Asia, China. Ireland got a Guernsey, but that's alphabetisation. And then Korea and New Zealand as well. But quite a few clearly missing. And in some of the Southeast Asian nations, I'm sure there's work underway and I just don't know of it. But it's intriguing to see that places like Indonesia, I must catch up to see what's going there and many other places. So thinking, just reflecting on the Asian internet histories, having once again kind of had the opportunity to just focus a bit more on this work since the project Niels described, where we're trying to do a comparative cultural history of Australia and Asian internet histories, particularly with reference to China, Korea and Japan. So in this area, I think we find the work expanding, but really many location minorities and at the edge histories are underrepresented. I mean, it's really striking in the papers we've published. There are quite a few on Indian internet histories. Actually, Indian internet histories has been some really fascinating historiographical and theoretical work. In the Global Internet Histories book, we published fantastic essay by Nishant Shah, who's currently based in a Dutch institution, but who quite a long while ago did a project on Indian internet histories when he was at the Centre for Internet and Society in Bangalore, which was one of the conceptually most interesting efforts around conceptualising internet histories I've yet seen, and that was done a long time ago. But we published a lot of work on particularly Chinese internet histories at all sorts of different angles on that, Korean and Japan also. We published a paper on Malaysian internet, but there are a number of other papers on Southeast Asian internet histories that we hope to gather, and a lot of other locations where we just don't really have a great deal of idea, or the scholarship that exists might be from people who are doing other kinds of work on digital technology, then are making an effort to historicise or write historically about it. But I think the other thing that remains as well is that, there's this kind of sense in which it often goes on, maybe because of the language and cultural and other complexities, geopolitical complexities or geographical complexities, a lack of the awareness of internet imaginaries and histories that are there in Asian contexts and scholarship, particularly in other languages. So the work's there, but it doesn't get translated, it doesn't circulate even more so, and it's part of obviously a more complex global set of research and knowledge exchanges about how do you kind of make this work happen across different languages, across very uneven resources, university systems, cultural institution infrastructures, and so on. So I think we really just felt struck once again, this is treasure trove of work in histories in Asia, Asian languages, perspectives, conceptualizations. It's still barely registered. It's there, much of it's in the sources in the special issue. That may be the case in many other parts of the world as well. It certainly is. And I think in Global Internet Histories, the book we did, the companion, we got some sort of glimmering of that as well. Okay, so talked a bit about global internet histories, Asian internet history. So I wanted to segue, which in some ways is a naturalized segue in talking about Asian internet histories, to talk about mobile internet and web and apps histories in and from Asian locations. I mean, part of this, the segue, the naturalization of it is the part of the sense in which a key way that internet evolved in Asia, particularly more in the popular phases, was around mobiles and mobile communications. And I'll just talk about that in relation to Japan. It's a bit more complex than that, it turns out, but it's really important. And I think in part of why I think this might be of interest is that here, I suppose this is part of what we're trying to grapple with at the moment, I think, around internet histories and around the infrastructures and the archives, right? The kind of the ways in which internet, digital technologies and cultures are finding their roots through things that have a glancing relationship to the web, but aren't the web. And that's a kind of complex problem. Often we use the web to find out about them because otherwise the information's occluded. So that's a kind of leitmotif in the scholarship here. So let me just sort of unpack this a little bit. But first I just wanted to shout out a little bit to Telephone Histories, and here in Singapore of the payphones and the village payphones. There's one there in Singapore. These are called kampungs, using the Malay word. And Singapore like to have a kampung mentality, but it's mostly in the public housing towers now and the condominiums, because I think there's only one kampung in the whole island. But you can see in this one image in the 60s someone using a phone in a phone booth, and then there's some other public phones. Then a lot of the other sort of abbreviated history of mobile phones in Asia. So a picture here of a woman from the Indian subcontinent with a mobile phone carrying an order, to suppose stand in for this sense in which the mobile phone became this demotic technology across so many areas of the world, particularly through the 1990s. But let me dive into the mobile web. And I wrote a chapter for Nielsen in Milligan's Sage Handbook of Web Histories on the mobile web. So I've got a couple of images here, one of sort of the WAP, the Wireless Access Protocol, and it's famously slow loading web pages on a Nokia communicator phone. And then the Opera mini browser, a sort of iconic browser of low bandwidth mobiles in this kind of pre-smartphone age. But just to pick up this sort of discussion about Asian internet histories and the intersection with mobiles histories, that famously Japan kind of made mobile online communication work with its version of the mobile internet called iMode. And in doing so, famously then did in a sense proof of concept for things like mobile data services, mobile music, ringtones, and a whole lot of then accoutrements of sort of mobile phone culture that then really came home to roost with the smartphone. And so there's also the book here by one of the pioneers, Takeshi Natsuno, the iMode strategy book. Another kind of moment in this sort of intertwined histories of internet mobiles in different Asian regions is the BlackBerry, another forerunner, the Canadian Research in Motion RIM company from out Waterloo way north of Toronto, and the BlackBerry that really pioneered some of the sort of always-on mobile media, and that this was big, famously big in Indonesia, and that Why is Indonesia so in love with BlackBerry? Is this piece in BBC World Service 2011, and then a piece when they closed down BlackBerry Messenger saying BlackBerry Messenger's closed. You know, how are we going to find our data? How's that kind of working? So coming to closer to where we are in terms of time, one recent and sort of complex phenomenon that's just got sort of widespread implications that scholars have been grappling with is the sort of phenomenon that's sometimes called now Asian super apps, even breathlessly in probably more the business press and in other areas. So we've got a few instances of these that I've been thinking about recently. WeChat being the Chinese app, which has the kind of messaging component, but has a range of other services, including mobile money, but also famously has mini programs. So it has these programs within WeChat that people develop programs for. And so this is why in this book, Super Sticky WeChat in Chinese Society by Julie Chen and Jack Zhou and another author, talk about that WeChat as the all-in-one app, saying that WeChat was initially not social media, but it gradually grew into one and then outgrew it. So it's interesting. A bit like there are other Chinese legacy kind of messaging softwares like QQ, the most famous one that's still around and has its own sort of specificities as a platform. So WeChat is one now quite well known and sometimes controversial app. And I wanted to just go to then also just mentioning now some of the other apps that get talked about in this Asian super apps kind of enthusiasm, and a couple particularly in Southeast Asia. Gojek is an Indonesian app that has really been huge in Indonesia and has started to be taken up in other parts of Southeast Asia and get some global attention as well. Gojek refers to the kind of motorbikes, small kind of scooters that get you around cities like Jakarta that are super busy. And in 2019, when President Jokowi reconfigured his cabinet, one of the founders of Gojek became the culture minister. That was a really interesting moment in time. And so, and on this slide, as well as Gojek, there's the Malaysian super app called Grab, which is actually in Singapore. That's our kind of Uber. Actually, Uber had tried to merge with Grab and fell foul, which is a rare thing in Singapore, of the competition regulators and had to exit the market. So Grab was in Malaysia and then came to Singapore, but it is making inroads across Southeast Asia and has been the subject of international attention because of its kind of listing as well. So these are both apps that have some aspiration to really be super apps, to take on a range of services and for people to have, they're not quite as sticky as WeChat, but people to be living kind of everyday lives in them. Another one that Mark Steinberg has written a fantastic book about it recently, about its evolution of, is Line, which is a Japanese messaging platform, social media, social networking service that it's become a really important app in Japan and also in Korea. And so Mark Steinberg talks about this as a national or regional chat app within a field otherwise dominated by FANG, the US, Google, Facebook, etc., or BAT, the Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent superpowers, the Chinese digital giants, using its character know-how to gain a foothold and potentially expand its reach from Japan to East and Southeast Asia. Another really interesting super app. Okay, so I mentioned some of these apps that many people are trying to grapple with and understand the extraordinary way in which they've sort of taken hold in people's lives, and to sort of probably sort the wheat from the chaff of the great over-promising around this in a way that historians of technology know all too well and can give many examples about. But I think it does feed into, I think, some of these questions about, and particularly perhaps from international perspectives and transnational perspectives, about what the interplay with this is. these histories are and will be, and also questions about how we get access to these histories, how we get the materials, how we think about the archival questions. And so Nielsen, in the piece, the web's first 25 years was just saying, well, on the threshold to the next 25 years of web history, the question then is whether mobile media apps will outcompete the web and make it obsolete. He's saying as long as users want easy access between information systems, the web's hyperlinks may be the killer app, make the web survive for another 25 years. So it's interesting to see how we're feeling about that now. And some people, particularly in the app studies area, through the App Studies Initiative, have been doing some really, really interesting work, thinking through the kind of materialities of these, one of them being Anne Hellman. And then in this piece, Fernando van der Vliest, who wrote this nice piece in the past web on platforms and apps histories. But the platformization of Facebook is actually the most downloaded paper in the Internet Histories Journal, for which we're eternally grateful. And it is also just a super interesting effort to try and think through how you gather the evidence and the data and the documents and sort of think through these kind of histories. And I think apps are, and I found this in writing a book on apps, just incredibly fascinating because of this sort of shift, this sort of interesting sense in which you're dealing with software. You're dealing now with particularly with platforms, because all this discussion about super apps that I've just been mentioning sort of presumes like extraordinary infrastructures, computational infrastructures, algorithmic infrastructures, complexity of organizational forms around these, and a whole bunch of other kind of assemblages that come together. So Anne and Fernando in this piece say, material perspective, platform maps are different from other digital objects such as websites. As a consequence, there are challenges with regard to their archiving and study, as well as new opportunities. And I just wonder if this is more so if we're thinking about apps from different locations, right? And we're thinking about this. I mean, I think it's, in a broader sense, much of, there's a whole set of discussions about, say, digital platforms that talks about values, right, and imaginaries. And some of that discussion is incredibly interesting, like the Platform Society book, right? It's got really interesting discussion of like American versus European sort of perspectives on the values and the imaginaries and various critiques. I use that in teaching my digital platforms course. I don't think there's that kind of work actually about the Asian imaginaries of apps. Jack Cho actually is writing a book about the geopolitics of digital platforms, which will be one perspective on that. I think Mark Steinberg's work with some other people as well. But if we think through some of these materialities and the archival, the language issues and so on, it'd be really interesting to think through that from some of these different locations, particularly from the Asian locations, when you've got these, what's been happening is the development of these kind of apps that are going across different regions that are complex infrastructures and firms in their own right. And of course, some of these firms are headquartered, like Grab, the Malaysian firm that moved to Singapore. It's headquartered in those kind of evanescent, kind of, I can't remember if it's the Bahamas exactly, but it goes through Delaware. The corporate trails are really interesting to find out in their own right, let alone how would you get access to the contents of this, of people's, communication on this, or if you're writing histories of these apps, how do you get access to this? And in this, in this kind of work that's going on, you see, particularly through Anne's work, that the importance of web archives and thinking through repositories, right, software repositories, and how you can get hold of those, how they work. Okay, so just to conclude then, to just kind of think about, bring together some of these reflections and really scattered thoughts. As we expand the circles and networks of internet histories and web and digital archives, we clearly face even greater challenges and opportunities than those charted and been put on the agenda so far. And I think this is, this Asian internet and mobile histories are one major area which underscore the imperatives for extending and consolidating the field, its infrastructure and capacities. As well as these difficulties, just in this last part of what I've been kind of presenting, that are evident in the evolving Asian super apps, in archiving, collecting and interpreting the born digital across platforms, formats, different kinds of archives, including archives yet to be constructed. web archives remain absolutely a key source in this emergent work. And so much of the work is going to use, whether it's National Archives or whether it's the Wayback, archive, Internet Archive, and so on. But this private commercial character of the digital platforms is one of the key stumbling blocks, as well as the affordances and the nature of the technology. So thinking about how you deal with the vagaries of API access, and then what people post API access as well. So I think, to just conclude, I think sticking together the transnational is increasingly the raison d'etre of the sort of unfolding of the technologies, super apps, for instance. This because of particularly in the last 2 years, the kind of weaving in of certain sorts of geopolitics, the resurgence of national sovereignty. You've seen the banning of apps and so on. It's really an interesting thing. But how, maybe more from our perspectives, how we create, perpetuate, and stitch together the artifacts, the archives, the context, and repositories is perhaps even a greater hurdle, or at least a greater hurdle. But it's crucial for a widening and probably more enriching range of scholarly work and civic and cultural and political purposes and projects, as some of the great work that's unfolding on memory and memory studies shows. So look, I'll finish up there. Thanks very much for your attention and listening. Really appreciate it.
As you can maybe hear, Gerard, there's clapping in this room here, and there's a lot of clapping in the virtual room.
Oh, that's great.
Thank you very, very much.
I'll clap in sign language, at least in some sign language.
And thanks for this thought-provoking and exciting presentation of, well, a lot of things related to internet history. So it's really, really great to hear that.
Thank you.
I will now start.